A winter storm of historic proportions bore down on the ragged edge of the Montana wilderness, burying the world beneath a white so heavy it pressed the forests silent. Wind screamed through the skeletal pines, shoving snow in swirling columns across the lonely valley floor. In the heart of this chaos, a wild Mustang mare named Dakota fought forward, her coat a deep earthen brown against the endless expanse of white. At her trembling side staggered her newborn foal, Echo, barely a day old, legs quivering with the effort of each step. Snow packed around their hooves, rising nearly to Dakota's chest, and each breath steamed from their nostrils only to be shredded away by the icy gale. Dakota pressed her nose to Echo's flank, urging him to keep moving. She had led him away from the open range when the first flakes started falling, her instincts screaming of danger, even as her body ached from the ordeal of giving birth. But the world was shifting beneath her feet, drifts growing, the familiar landmarks swallowed whole by snow and dark, and the scent of shelter gone. In the blizzard, sound and sight dissolved into nothing. Only the need to survive remained. Suddenly, the ice beneath them cracked with a sharp, splintering snap. Dakota reared back in terror as Echo slipped, his legs pinwheeling. The foal's terrified whinny cut through the howl of wind, and then, gone. Echo's small body plunged through the brittle skin of a frozen lake, vanishing in a chaos of churning water and shattered ice. For a moment, Dakota stood frozen with fear, her muscles locked and eyes wide. She lunged toward the hole, slipping and sliding, whinnying in panic as she searched for her baby. Echo's head broke the surface for a desperate instant, his eyes wide with confusion and terror, hooves scrabbling at the slick edge. The ice splintered further beneath Dakota's weight. She circled the hole, whinnying, unable to help, helpless as her foal thrashed and vanished again under the freezing water. Each second stretched long and brutal as the snow swirled and covered the evidence of disaster. The air was thick with the stench of fear and desperation. Elsewhere, a beam of light swept through the chaos, a flashlight, its narrow glow barely denting the blizzard. Claire Bennett moved against the storm, snow plastered to her parka, scarf wound tight around her face. Claire was a wildlife biologist, young but already forged by Montana's wild weather and the long, lonely patrols that came with her job. She was on a winter storm patrol, tasked with checking on wildlife and monitoring snow conditions. Her boots crunched over the frozen ground as she pushed forward, muttering to herself, breath puffing in quick clouds. Then she heard it, a sound so raw it cut through the storm, the frantic whinny of a horse, higher and more desperate than anything she'd ever heard. Claire paused, heart hammering, then angled her light toward the noise. What she saw froze her in place. A wild mare circling a hole in the ice, eyes wild and rolling, and the faintest flash of movement in the water. "God, no! Hold on!" she yelled, voice barely audible over the wind. She sprinted toward the scene, heart pounding with adrenaline. The mare reared, hooves slicing the air between them, but Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed the axe slung over her shoulder and began smashing the ice, each swing a desperate gamble. The axe bit through frozen layers, sending shards skittering over the snow. The foal surfaced again, barely conscious, legs trembling in the slush. Claire dropped to her knees and lunged forward, plunging her arm into the water, grabbing blindly for the small, sodden body. With a grunt, she hauled Echo up, her hands burning with cold. The mare lunged, teeth bared, but Claire's instincts took over. She talked in low, soothing tones, making herself small, avoiding sudden movements. She pulled off her insulated jacket, wrapping it around the shivering foal, who gasped and wheezed, eyes rolling back. Dakota paced just out of reach, every muscle strung tight, her body shivering with both cold and terror. But she never ran, not with her foal so near. Claire moved carefully, one eye on Dakota, the other on Echo, whose breathing was shallow and erratic. The storm howled, threatening to erase their tracks and bury them all. Claire looked around wildly, knowing that staying out here meant death for all three. "Come on, girl, let me help him. We have to move now," Claire murmured, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Dakota tossed her head, blowing steam, but she watched as Claire gingerly lifted Echo, holding him close. Step by step, Claire inched backward, showing Dakota the path, coaxing her to follow. For one breathless moment, it seemed Dakota might bolt, but the bond of mother and foal was stronger than fear. She fell in behind, nostrils flaring, muscles quaking, as Claire led them through the drifts toward a shape looming out of the white. A research cabin, barely visible, half buried in snow. Inside, the storm battered the walls, and the cabin's windows rattled. But for a brief moment, as the door slammed shut and the world outside became muffled, there was a sense of hope. Claire dropped to her knees, cradling Echo, and glanced up at Dakota, who filled the doorway, eyes burning with a wild, wary intelligence. They were three survivors, alone together in the teeth of the storm, each dependent on the others in ways none of them yet understood. And so began a night where trust, fear, and the will to survive would be tested with every hour the blizzard raged. The wind howled like a living thing outside the cabin, rattling the windows and sending snowflakes swirling through the cracks in the old wooden frame. Inside, the small room was stifling with tension. Claire Bennett moved fast, her boots leaving wet prints on the floorboards as she bolted the door behind Dakota. The wild mare stood rigid, nostrils flaring, breath coming in ragged bursts. Her eyes stayed locked on Claire's every move, ready to bolt or strike at the first hint of danger. But she didn't run. Her entire focus was on the sodden, barely breathing foal bundled in Claire's arms. Claire laid Echo gently on the floor, near the fireplace, working as quickly as the adrenaline and biting cold would allow. She didn't dare turn her back to Dakota, but she needed both hands to save the foal. Flickering firelight caught on the mare's deep brown coat, showing streaks of frozen sweat and bits of snow clinging to her mane. Claire reached for the emergency kit and grabbed towels, moving with careful, deliberate gestures. "It's okay, Mama. I'm just helping your baby," she murmured, trying to keep her voice calm and low, almost a chant against the terror vibrating in the room. Echo let out a weak, shuddering whinny, legs twitching as Claire rubbed him down with a towel. His eyes fluttered open, then closed again. Claire's heart hammered. She'd seen hypothermia before in the wild, but never in a newborn foal. She stripped off her own flannel shirt, wrapping it around him for extra warmth, then dug out her insulated jacket and layered it over the towels. Every motion was slow and careful. She could feel Dakota's anxiety like static in the air, the threat of a sudden kick or charge lurking just behind her watchful gaze. Dakota stamped a hoof, ears back, torn between fear and the primal urge to stay near her foal. Claire stayed as low as possible, never making eye contact, and began massaging Echo's spindly legs, coaxing circulation back into them. With each minute, Echo's shivering grew less violent, but his breathing remained ragged. Claire scanned the cabin for anything that could help. An old insulated sleeping bag. Perfect. She crawled over, dragging it back to Echo's side, tucking him inside and piling towels over him like a nest. She risked a glance at Dakota. The mare edged closer, her body taut and trembling, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Claire tried to read her body language, a flick of the ear, the shifting of weight. Wild Mustangs trusted no one, especially not humans, but something in Dakota's stance kept her from attacking or fleeing. Claire whispered, "I know you don't understand me, but I promise I'm on your side. You just gotta trust me for tonight." She turned to the fire, feeding in more kindling and fanning the flames. Heat radiated out, just enough to start warming the small room, but not enough to melt the wall of ice growing outside. The storm intensified, the cabin groaning as gusts battered the walls. Claire's fingers ached with cold, but she focused on the task. Keep Echo alive, keep Dakota calm, keep herself in one piece. She checked Echo's gums, pressing gently, still pale but not as bad as before. With Echo secure, Claire faced her next challenge: how to feed a foal too weak to stand. She rummaged through her supplies and found a bottle of electrolyte solution meant for emergencies. Pouring some into the cap, she held it to Echo's lips. He barely responded. Dakota snorted, stepping forward, her body a shield between Claire and her foal. Claire pulled back, holding her hands up. "It's okay. He needs this. You can watch. Just stay with him." An idea struck. Claire tore open her pack, finding a granola bar and a handful of apples she'd brought for field rations. She set them down on the floor, as close to Dakota as she dared, then backed off. The mare sniffed at the apples, but didn't eat. Her focus was on Echo. Claire tried again with the bottle, coaxing a few precious drops into the foal's mouth. This time Echo swallowed, a small victory, but a victory all the same. As the night deepened, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The radio was dead, the power lines long since buried beneath snow. The world outside was silent except for the roar of the blizzard. Inside, the odd trio survived minute by minute. Claire cycled between tending Echo, adding fuel to the fire, and speaking quietly to Dakota, narrating her actions as if the mare could understand. Just putting another log on, just checking his breathing, just making sure we're all okay. At one point, Claire dozed off against the wall, waking with a start when Dakota let out a sharp, warning snort. A draft rattled the window. No danger, just the wind. She realized with a jolt that Dakota had settled closer, her body between Claire and the door, as if recognizing that they were both on guard for the same reason. Echo, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets and coats, was breathing a little more evenly, his legs tucked beneath him at last. Claire reached out to touch his muzzle, and Dakota allowed it, just for a moment. The cabin became a fragile oasis. Three creatures from different worlds, thrown together by a storm that cared nothing for boundaries or fears. Claire stared into the flames, exhaustion dragging at her bones. The sense of victory was tempered by the knowledge that dawn was still hours away, and anything could happen. But for now, the only thing that mattered was the heartbeat of the foal, the wary trust of his mother, and the hope that survival could be carved out of even the wildest night. As the wind howled on and the snow piled higher, Claire looked at Dakota, no longer just a wild Mustang, but a fellow survivor. For one long night, woman and horse stood together against nature's fury, united by the fierce, unspoken promise to protect the weakest among them. And in that storm-battered cabin, against all odds, the first fragile threads of trust began to weave themselves between them. Time passed slowly inside the cramped, battered cabin, each minute stretching out as Claire hovered between exhaustion and vigilance. The storm raged on beyond the thin wooden walls, but inside, the chaos of nature was replaced by a tense, uneasy stillness. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that crawled over Dakota's tense body and the tiny, blanketed shape of Echo curled by the hearth. Claire moved with purpose, every motion careful and measured. She checked Echo's breathing for the 100th time, pressing gentle fingers along his chest, then reaching to rub his legs in slow, steady circles. The foal's coat was still damp, but no longer icy. His shivers had faded from violent to soft, involuntary twitches. Claire glanced over her shoulder at Dakota, whose gaze was sharp and watchful, every muscle wound tight as a spring. The mare's large, dark eyes followed her with a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. Echo's breathing came easier now, and he managed a weak nicker, craning his neck toward his mother. Dakota stepped closer, lowering her head to nuzzle him, the two touching noses in a silent conversation more honest than words. Claire sat back on her heels, letting the moment play out, careful not to intrude. She felt the pressure of the day settling into her bones, the terror and adrenaline slowly draining, leaving only a raw ache in her muscles and a weight behind her eyes. In the quiet, Claire realized just how vulnerable they all were. The cabin was little more than a shack. One main room, a battered cot, the wood stove, and the battered remains of a table and chair. A single lantern hung from a nail, its yellow light just bright enough to push back the edges of night. Every so often, a gust would rattle the glass and send a chill through the room, but the fire kept most of the cold at bay. Claire shared her rations, energy bars, apples, and a bag of feed pellets left over from a previous project. She placed the food near Dakota, who hesitated before nosing the apples, finally taking a cautious bite. Claire smiled to herself at this small sign of trust. She refilled Echo's bottle, mixing water warmed by the fire with a little sugar and salt to replace lost electrolytes. At first, Echo refused to suckle, his strength nearly gone. But Dakota nickered softly, and Claire stroked the foal's muzzle, coaxing him until he took a few tentative swallows. Each tiny gulp felt like a miracle. Hours passed in a blur. Claire alternated between tending Echo, adding logs to the fire, and checking the windows and door for damage. At times she would simply sit, back against the wall, breathing in time with the gentle rise and fall of Echo's chest, listening to Dakota's restless shifting on the planks. She tried to push away the thoughts of what might happen if the storm worsened, or if Echo's condition turned for the worse. For now, all that mattered was the fragile peace in the room. Dakota's wariness never faded completely, but as the night deepened, she allowed Claire to move freely, so long as she kept low and didn't make sudden movements. At one point, Claire nodded off, head drooping over her knees, only to wake with a start when Dakota let out a snort. The mare had positioned herself between Claire and Echo, her body a living shield. Claire took the hint and edged away, murmuring, "All right, Mama, he's safe with you." Later, as midnight neared, Claire heard the wind outside slow just a bit, the shriek fading to a steady moan. She stood and stretched, her back crackling, and checked the weather radio once more. Still dead. Just static. She wrapped herself in a spare blanket and curled up on the floor a few feet from the Mustangs, unwilling to risk the cot in case Dakota viewed it as a threat. She let her mind wander, thinking of home, of her own mother who'd taught her to respect animals and never underestimate the wild. She thought of the research project she was supposed to be running, the endless paperwork and sensor data. None of that mattered now. What mattered was here, the tiny foal sleeping fitfully by the fire, the wild mare with eyes full of defiance and terror, and her own responsibility to keep them safe through the night. Sometime in the small hours, Echo stirred. Claire woke immediately, every sense alert. The foal struggled to rise, legs folding and unfolding beneath him. Dakota knelt down beside him, curling her body protectively. Claire let the scene unfold, her presence almost forgotten for the moment. Echo tried to stand, wobbled, and flopped back onto the nest of blankets. Dakota nickered encouragement, licking his muzzle and flanks. After a few tries, Echo managed to sit upright, looking around with glassy, uncertain eyes. Claire grinned through her exhaustion. "That's it, little guy. You're tougher than you look." Morning was still hours away, but the room was a little warmer, the fire crackling steadily. Claire sat up, rubbing her eyes, and reached for the battered notebook she always carried. She jotted down quick notes, temperatures, observations about Dakota's behavior, Echo's progress. It helped her keep focus and maybe reminded her there was still order to be found in the middle of chaos. In the quiet, Dakota's stance softened a little more. She no longer flinched at every movement. Sometimes her eyes would close for a few moments at a time, only to snap open when Echo shifted or Claire stirred. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something like tolerance, a fragile peace built on necessity. As dawn edged closer, a pale blue light began to seep around the edges of the window, and the wind seemed to grow tired at last. Claire pulled her blanket tighter, feeling the first hints of hope return. Against every odd, the three of them had survived the blizzard's fiercest night. They were battered, exhausted, and far from safe, but for now, they were together. Echo slept at last, breathing slow and steady, Dakota's nose pressed to his side. Claire sat by the fire, her eyes heavy but her mind alert. She realized with wonder that in a single night, a wild Mustang, a newborn foal, and a lone human had learned to coexist, each clinging to life and finding uneasy peace in the shared warmth of a tiny, storm-battered cabin. By the time the storm finally spent itself, dawn had started to seep across the Montana wilderness, painting the snowdrifts in shades of gray and icy blue. The relentless wind faded into a hollow, distant moan. For the first time in hours, the world outside the cabin felt less like a threat and more like a silent witness to their survival. Inside, the battered little room was hushed except for the soft, steady breathing of Echo and the comforting crackle of embers burning low in the stove. Claire blinked blearily in the half-light, stiff from sleeping upright and sore in every muscle. She sat up, wrapped in her threadbare blanket, and surveyed the scene. Echo lay curled in the nest of towels and blankets, his sides gently rising and falling. His coat, though still matted in places, looked cleaner and drier than it had the night before. Dakota lay beside him, her long legs tucked neatly under her, eyes wide open but calm. For the first time, the wild Mustang didn't bristle or shift away when Claire moved. Claire rose slowly, careful not to break the spell of peace. The air was cold enough to sting her nose, but not nearly as brutal as it had been the night before. She tossed a few more sticks onto the fire, stoking it back to life. The flames grew, their warmth seeping into the space, pushing back the chill and lighting Dakota's deep brown coat with a soft glow. As she moved about the room, Dakota's eyes followed her, not with the rolling panic of the previous night, but with a cautious, exhausted interest. Claire knelt by Echo, checking him gently. His ears flicked, and he turned toward her touch. The foal's breathing was steadier now, his gums less pale, and when she offered him the makeshift bottle, he suckled greedily for the first time. Claire felt a surge of hope. "You're a fighter, little one," she whispered, unable to keep the relief out of her voice. Dakota stretched her neck and touched her nose to Echo, then to Claire's hand, her breath warm and surprisingly gentle. Claire froze, heart thumping, then exhaled softly, letting Dakota sniff her palm before drawing away. It was a small moment, but an important one. In the fragile quiet of dawn, a thread of trust had begun to weave itself between wild Mustang and woman. Claire found herself talking softly as she worked, narrating her movements to Dakota as if they were old friends. She tidied the cramped cabin, made tea with water boiled over the fire, and split one of her last apples, offering half to the mare. Dakota hesitated, nostrils flaring, then took it from Claire's hand with a quick, deliberate motion. Echo tried to stand, legs trembling, and Claire moved to steady him, whispering encouragement. This time Dakota didn't block her path. The sun crept higher, sending bright rays through the frosted window. Outside, the storm had sculpted the world into strange, beautiful shapes. Drifts curled against tree trunks, icicles hanging like glass daggers from the eaves. Claire opened the door just a crack, letting in a rush of fresh, clean air. For a long moment, Dakota tensed, watching every movement, but she didn't try to bolt. Instead, she seemed to understand. They were safe, at least for now. Claire stepped outside, boots crunching in the snow. The landscape was eerily silent, as if the whole world was holding its breath. She checked the roof and perimeter, making sure the cabin hadn't suffered more damage. A few shingles were missing, and the snow was piled so high against one side that the window was almost buried. But the structure held. She scooped up a bucket of snow to melt for water and returned inside, shivering from the brief exposure. Back in the warmth, Claire found Dakota watching her, head tilted. Claire smiled. "See? Still here. Still on your side." She moved to the stove and set the snow to melt. Echo was dozing, his body pressed close to his mother's. The bond between them was palpable, and Claire respected it. She moved slowly, never reaching for Dakota unless absolutely necessary. A few hours passed in this delicate peace. Claire ate what was left of her rations, savoring every bite, and shared with Dakota again, breaking a granola bar in half. Dakota's trust grew by degrees. She allowed Claire to approach, to stroke Echo, to clean his legs with a wet cloth. She even accepted water from Claire's cupped hands, drinking deeply and then tossing her head with a satisfied snort. As the day wore on, the sun melted a thin sheen of ice from the windows, sending rainbows dancing over the walls. The world outside seemed to be waking up from a long nightmare. Claire took a moment to rest, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her back against the rough planks. She watched Dakota and Echo, awed by the resilience that burned in both their eyes. A memory surfaced. Her mother teaching her how to approach horses as a child. Move slow, talk low, show your hands, let them come to you, never force it. The advice felt truer now than ever. She realized she wasn't just keeping these animals alive. She was part of something rare, something wild and honest that could only exist in a place like this, in a moment like this. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to close her eyes, trusting Dakota to keep watch. The cabin was quiet, except for the sound of Dakota's breath and Echo's occasional soft nicker. She drifted for a little while, dozing in the golden light. When she woke, Dakota was still there, pressed protectively beside her foal, but the fear was gone from her stance. She watched Claire with something close to curiosity, maybe even gratitude. Afternoon slipped by in silence, broken only by small, necessary chores, checking the door, tending the fire, coaxing Echo to stand and stretch. Each time Claire moved close, Dakota allowed it, even stepping back to let her help. Trust, built on necessity, was now growing out of respect. Outside, the sky had turned a dazzling blue, and the snow shone like diamonds. Claire knew the reprieve might not last. A storm like this could be followed by more trouble. But for now, as the sun climbed high and the world seemed remade, she felt a fragile hope. The day ended with Dakota lying down fully, her body relaxed, eyes finally closing as she drifted to sleep beside her foal. Claire watched them, wrapped in her blanket, heart pounding with a strange, deep contentment. They had survived the night. In the hush of the cabin, a wild Mustang and a human shared a fragile peace, proof that trust, once earned, could survive even the fiercest storm. The calm that had settled over the tiny cabin didn't last. As evening approached, the wind picked up again. Not the shrieking blizzard of the previous night, but a restless, hungry breeze that rattled the glass and set the world outside back on edge. The sun, which had glimmered off fresh snow all afternoon, dipped low behind the pines. Shadows stretched long and blue across the drifts. Claire tended the fire, quietly grateful for the fragile bond she'd built with Dakota and Echo, and thinking they'd weathered the worst the wild had to offer. She was wrong. It started with a change in Dakota's posture. The mare, who had finally seemed to relax, suddenly went rigid, her ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as she lifted her head from Echo's side and turned toward the door. Claire noticed the shift immediately. She froze, listening. The only sound at first was the pop and hiss of sap in the wood stove, and Echo's soft snuffling as he dreamed. Then, an unmistakable crunch outside. Something heavy, moving with purpose, circling the cabin. Dakota let out a low, guttural whinny that made every hair on Claire's arms stand up. Claire moved quietly to the window, careful not to startle the Mustangs, and peered through the frost-rimmed glass. The fading daylight barely reached the edge of the trees, but what she saw made her heart slam against her ribs. A hulking shadow, too broad for a wolf or deer, lumbered through the drifts. She caught the glint of an eye, the matted curve of a great brown shoulder, then the unmistakable shape of a bear. It was thin, starving even. Winter had stripped the land bare, and the storm had driven all the easy prey deep into hiding. Now, drawn by the scent of animals, warmth, and human food, the bear had come looking for a meal. Claire's mind raced. She'd dealt with bears before, but never one so desperate, so close, and certainly not while trapped with a wild Mustang and her newborn foal. The bear tested the porch, snuffling along the doorframe. It rose on hind legs, massive paws scraping at the wood. The entire cabin seemed to shrink around Claire. She backed away, searching for anything that might serve as a weapon. The axe was propped by the fire, but she couldn't risk grabbing it yet, not without panicking Dakota. Instead, she grabbed a metal pan and her emergency flare kit, heart hammering. Dakota shifted between Claire and Echo, muscles bunched, tail lashing. She pawed the ground, snorting warning after warning. Echo, sensing the tension, rose on shaky legs and pressed close to his mother's side. The bear thudded against the door, rattling it in its frame. For a terrifying moment, Claire wondered if the old hinges would hold. "Stay calm, Dakota. We're not letting anything in," Claire whispered. More for herself than for the animals, she inched toward the door, gripping the metal pan in one hand, the flare in the other. She remembered everything she'd learned about bear encounters. Make noise, look big, never let them think you're prey. But how could she keep the animals safe too? Suddenly, the bear changed tactics, circling to the window. Its snout smeared the glass, claws leaving ragged streaks. Dakota reared, slamming her hooves on the wood floor, the noise thunderous in the tiny space. Claire seized the moment, banging the pan as hard as she could, yelling at the top of her lungs, "Go away! Get out!" The bear flinched, but didn't flee. Hunger made it reckless. The beast battered the window, and for an awful instant, Claire thought the glass would shatter. She raised the flare, snapping the cap and striking the fuse. A harsh red light blossomed in her hand, filling the cabin with eerie, unnatural glow. The bear reared back, eyes catching the flare's fire, but it didn't run. Instead, it roared, deep, guttural, shaking the very floorboards. Dakota reared again, trumpeting defiance, hooves cracking against the boards. Echo pressed against Dakota's flank. His eyes wide with fear, Claire stood her ground, forcing herself to be loud and unpredictable, brandishing the flare through the window and clanging the pan until her arm ached. For a heartbeat, it felt like a losing battle. Man, horse, and foal against the implacable force of nature itself. The bear circled again, testing the cabin from every angle. Each time it got too close, Claire flashed the flare and screamed. Dakota stomped and snorted, and Echo, barely understanding, added his tiny, desperate voice to the chaos. Finally, with a frustrated roar, the bear battered its shoulder against the window, cracking the pane with a sickening sound. The fragile barrier between safety and chaos was seconds from breaking. Claire's mind raced. If the bear got inside, they had no chance. She dug in her pack for a second flare, hands shaking. Dakota, as if sensing Claire's desperation, stomped with all her strength, rattling the stove and sending a rain of sparks into the air. Outside, the bear hesitated, confused by the noise, the light, the wild energy inside the tiny room. Claire let the second flare off, a blinding light and crackle that seemed to split the darkness. At last, the bear turned, shaking its head, retreating a few feet. It circled once more, then faded into the deepening dusk, driven off not by fear, but by confusion and the united fury of its would-be prey. The silence that followed was total, heavy. Claire's legs trembled as she slumped to the floor, the spent flare clattering from her fingers. Dakota stood tall, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the door, ready for another threat. Echo pressed close to her, heart pounding so loud Claire could hear it. They had survived, but only just. The world outside the cabin was no less dangerous now than it had been in the heart of the storm. But inside, woman and Mustang stood together, no longer just by necessity, but by choice. Their trust had been tested in fire, in fear, and in the face of the wild's relentless hunger. And somehow, through it all, it held. The cabin was filled with a raw, electric silence in the aftermath of the bear's attack. The flare's acrid scent still lingered in the air, and the cracked window let in a thin, icy draft, a reminder of how close disaster had come. Claire's heart thudded in her chest as she slowly stood up, wiping sweat from her brow with a trembling hand. Dakota stayed planted in the center of the room, muscles tight, nostrils flaring with every breath. Echo huddled beneath his mother's belly, seeking shelter in her shadow. For a long moment, all three stood frozen, listening for any sign that the bear would return. It did. A thunderous crash against the wall made Claire flinch. The bear's patience had snapped. Now it was determined, dangerous, and growing bolder with each attempt. Wood splintered as claws raked the siding. Dakota responded with a fierce, guttural scream, rearing onto her hind legs and slamming her hooves down so hard the whole cabin shook. Claire's survival instincts kicked in. She ran for the axe and the heavy iron fire poker, dragging both back to the door, where the hinges now creaked under the pressure of the beast's weight. "Hang in there, girl. We're not giving up," Claire muttered, her voice low and steady, more for Dakota than herself. With practiced hands, she struck another flare, its burning light painting the room red and wild. She fumbled for her emergency whistle and blew it with all her strength, a shrill, unnatural wail that echoed through the trees. The bear paused, disoriented, but only for a heartbeat. The battered window gave way with a crack that split the night. The bear's massive head appeared, jaws snapping, claws swiping shards of glass and snow into the room. Dakota bolted forward, placing herself between the bear and her foal. Her hooves slammed into the floor, teeth bared, eyes wide and wild. For a second, Claire caught a glimpse of pure, unbridled power, the force of a wild Mustang defending what mattered most. Claire didn't hesitate. She hurled the iron poker at the bear's snout, the metal glancing off with a clang. The bear roared, rage and hunger boiling together, and tried to force itself through the opening. Claire grabbed the axe, adrenaline burning away her fear, and swung at the window frame, sending more wood and glass flying, making the gap too jagged and narrow for the bear's full body to squeeze through. Dakota reared again, her front legs a blur of motion as she charged the window. Her hooves connected with the bear's muzzle, a sharp, savage strike that made the animal bellow and stagger back. In that moment, Dakota was pure instinct, a living storm, every muscle fired by terror and love. Echo pressed into her flank, trembling but silent, trusting his mother and the strange human who fought beside them. Claire's hands shook as she fumbled with the flare, pointing its searing light directly into the bear's eyes. The beast recoiled, blinded, but not defeated. It circled the cabin, claws scraping wood, the low growl vibrating through the floorboards. Claire could feel Dakota's tension. Every nerve in the mare's body screamed fight or flight. But still she didn't run. For a long, endless minute, it was chaos. Claire and Dakota shouted, stomped, and screamed. The bear battered every wall and window, furious but unable to break through. At one point, the animal tried the door again, slamming its weight into the hinges until they shrieked. Claire stood with the axe in both hands, ready to defend her new herd with everything she had. Finally, the bear made one last desperate lunge, but Dakota met it head-on, her scream echoing off the cabin walls. Her hooves cracked against the wood, splintering the sill and slamming into the bear's nose again. At the same instant, Claire fired off the last of her flares, the blazing firestorm igniting in the creature's face. That was enough. With a final, furious roar, the bear staggered backward, blinded and bloodied, retreating into the swirling snow. Claire collapsed against the wall, her knees weak, lungs heaving. Dakota stayed standing, sides quivering, her body still drawn tall between Echo and the threat outside. Only when the bear's shadow finally vanished into the trees did she relax, her muscles loosening with exhaustion. Inside the ruined cabin, Claire and Dakota stared at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They had stood together, woman and Mustang, side by side, not out of habit or necessity, but out of a bond forged in the furnace of crisis. Trust, once fragile, now felt solid, born of shared struggle and survival. Claire dragged a battered dresser in front of the broken window and stuffed old towels and blankets into the cracks to keep out the cold. Dakota paced the cabin, checking on Echo, sniffing Claire as if searching for injury. Echo, shaken but alive, nuzzled his mother's side, eyes wide with awe. As the adrenaline ebbed, Claire felt the sting of minor cuts and bruises. She poured water from the melted snow to clean her hands, then carefully checked Dakota for wounds. There was a scrape along the mare's flank and a trickle of blood on her leg, but nothing deep. "You're a warrior, girl," Claire whispered, her hand resting gently on Dakota's shoulder. The Mustang didn't flinch, only blinked, accepting the comfort, maybe even appreciating it. The night stretched on, but the danger felt more distant now, as if the bear's retreat had taken with it the very spirit of the storm. Claire sat by the fire, Dakota and Echo close at hand, and for the first time she felt they were truly a team. No longer was she just a rescuer, Dakota just a wild horse, and Echo just a foal. They were survivors, bound together by courage, desperation, and the will to protect one another. As the embers glowed and the wind finally quieted, Claire realized something had shifted. Out here, in the heart of the wilderness, she and Dakota had found something rare, a true partnership, fierce and unbreakable. And whatever new dangers the dawn might bring, they would face them together, united by the memory of the night they defended their little world from the wild's relentless hunger. Dawn crept across the battered Montana wilderness, light spilling over the devastation left by the blizzard and the bear's siege. Inside the cabin, a tense hush lingered, thick with the memory of the previous night's battle. The cracked window was patched as best as Claire could manage, and the door was barricaded, but the little shelter felt as fragile as the bond it had forged between woman and Mustang. Claire sat by the fire, exhausted but alert, watching Dakota and Echo with the wary protectiveness that had become second nature. Every time a branch snapped or the wind shifted, her heart leapt to her throat. Dakota, too, was on edge, her body positioned between her foal and the outside world, every muscle coiled, ears pricked toward the battered door. But as the morning wore on, a new urgency settled over the trio. The damage from the bear's attack was clear. The window frame was splintered, the door hung unevenly on its hinges, and the cold was already seeping in. With every gust, snow drifted through the cracks. The fire wouldn't last forever. Worse, there was no guarantee the bear or another predator wouldn't return. It was clear to Claire, staying was not an option. She rummaged through her pack, taking stock. Her radio beacon had a few hours of battery left. She could try to get a distress signal out, but the nearest ranger station was miles away, and the deep drifts would swallow her on foot. She needed a plan that involved moving all three of them, Echo included, before exhaustion or injury claimed one of them. She eyed the battered furniture, an idea forming. "All right, team," she muttered, mostly to herself but also to Dakota, who watched her every move. "It's time to get out of here." With hands stiff from cold and fatigue, Claire went to work. She tore apart the broken table, pulling the longest, sturdiest planks free and using paracord from her emergency kit to lash them together. The result was crude but functional, a sled just large enough to hold a small foal. She layered the surface with blankets, coats, and whatever soft material she could find, then carefully lifted the groggy Echo onto it. The foal whimpered at first, legs kicking weakly, but Claire soothed him with soft words and gentle strokes. Dakota's reaction was immediate and fierce. She lunged forward, ears pinned and teeth bared, but Claire stood her ground, hands out in a placating gesture. "Easy, girl. I promise I'll never let him out of your sight. You're leading the way." She spoke in a low, rhythmic tone, keeping her movements slow and open. Dakota, tense and distrustful, finally relented, never taking her eyes off her foal. The next challenge was securing Echo for the journey. Claire fashioned a makeshift harness out of rope and torn strips of fabric, gently immobilizing the foal so he wouldn't tumble off the sled if they hit a drift. She checked his breathing, bundled him tighter, and pressed a kiss to his velvety forehead, an old habit from her years volunteering at animal rescues. "Hang on, little guy," she whispered. "We're getting you out of here." She rigged the sled to Dakota with another length of rope, fashioning a soft loop around the mare's shoulders. Dakota danced sideways at the strange sensation, eyes rolling, but allowed Claire to fasten the harness when she realized Echo was at the heart of it all. When Claire finally opened the battered cabin door, Dakota surged forward into the blinding, crystal air, her head held high, her focus absolute. She was wild, but she was also a mother. Nothing would keep her from protecting her child. The outside world was unrecognizable. Drifts rose taller than Claire's waist, and the snow had hardened into crusty ridges, treacherous and sharp. The sun glittered off the ice, masking the deep, deadly hollows beneath. Claire took a moment to get her bearings, using the flags she'd placed on her initial hike in, markers that now stuck up like lonely exclamation points across the endless white. Somewhere to the north, several miles away, was the nearest ranger outpost, and hopefully help. Claire wrapped her scarf tighter, tucked her radio beacon into her pocket, and set out ahead, forging a narrow trail. Dakota followed close, the sled dragging behind her, Echo bundled and silent. For the first 100 yards, every step was agony. Claire's thighs burned, her lungs ached, and her boots threatened to freeze to the snow. Dakota struggled too, snorting clouds of steam, her hooves slipping and sliding. More than once, Claire had to stop, coaxing the mare around a drift or clearing a path with her axe. But neither gave up. The memory of the bear, the broken cabin, and the fragile hope of survival pushed them onward. The journey was slow, grueling. The wind cut through every layer of clothing, stealing warmth and hope with every mile. Claire watched Dakota constantly, reading the mare's body language for signs of panic or exhaustion. More than once, Dakota stopped dead, nostrils flaring as she tested the wind for danger. At those moments, Claire would kneel beside the sled, rubbing Echo's legs to keep circulation going, whispering encouragement to both Mustangs. Hours passed in a haze of effort and determination. Claire's muscles trembled with fatigue, her hands numb. She forced herself onward by thinking only of the next step, the next flagged marker, the next patch of sunlight. When Echo whimpered or shivered, she redoubled her pace, urging Dakota to press on. Sometimes the mare responded with a low nicker, as if understanding Claire's desperation. Twice Claire thought she saw movement on the edge of the woods, a dark shape pacing them, silent as a shadow. Her heart stuttered in fear, but she didn't let herself stop. There was no going back. Every step took them closer to safety and the distant hope of rescue. Finally, as the sun dipped lower, painting the world in gold and blue, they crested a ridge. In the valley below, Claire saw the telltale glint of metal, the ranger outpost's radio antenna, rising above the snow. A relief almost brought her to her knees. She fumbled the radio beacon from her pocket, pressed the emergency call, and sent out a desperate message into the wild air. Dakota, sensing the end in sight, surged forward, pulling Echo's sled through the last stretch of snow. Claire stumbled after her, waving one arm, hope and exhaustion crashing over her in equal measure. She'd risked everything on this mad escape, and somehow, impossibly, they'd made it. As they reached the outpost, Claire fell to her knees, sobbing with gratitude. Dakota whinnied, standing protectively over Echo. They were battered, bruised, and frozen, but alive together on the threshold of safety. For the first time, the wild and the human world met not in conflict, but in desperate, shared triumph. And as the sun set on the Montana snow, Claire knew she would never forget the day they raced the storm and won. The orange and violet glow of sunset barely reached through the icy haze as Claire, Dakota, and Echo staggered into the ranger outpost's clearing. The little building, half buried in snow, its antenna crooked from the blizzard, had never looked so welcoming. Claire's legs buckled beneath her, exhaustion and adrenaline finally catching up. She hugged the radio beacon tight, willing the distress signal to reach someone, anyone, out there. Dakota stood tall and alert beside her, her body a living shield over the sled and her foal. Echo, still bundled in blankets and coats, blinked against the harsh cold, but lifted his head when the sled stopped. It was a moment of quiet triumph, the final breath after a night and day spent dancing with disaster. Minutes later, though to Claire it felt like years, A snowmobile's distant engine whined up the valley. Bright headlights cut through the falling dusk, bouncing off snowdrifts and pine trunks. Claire staggered to her feet, waving both arms and shouting hoarsely, her voice nearly lost in the wind. The machine swung around the outpost and came to a stop. The driver, Ranger Howard, a veteran with a gruff beard and kind eyes, scrambling off even before the engine died. "Claire, are you all right?" he called, his eyes widening as he took in the wild Mustang and Foal, the battered sled, and Claire's frostbitten face. "We need help, fast," Claire rasped, voice cracking. "Foal's half frozen. Mother's wild, but she won't leave him. We made it out, but just barely." Howard's radio crackled, and within minutes, more headlights appeared. A second snowmobile carrying Dr. Kim, the town's wildlife vet, and another ranger armed with medical supplies and thermal blankets. The team sprang into action, moving with practiced efficiency. Dr. Kim dropped to her knees beside Echo, her hands steady and calm despite the biting cold. "Let's get him in the heated trailer. Carefully. No sudden moves around the Mare," Dr. Kim cautioned. Dakota, trembling and snorting, pressed between Echo and the strangers. She tossed her head, eyes wide, and pawed at the snow. Claire, still running on fumes, crouched nearby, murmuring reassurances. "It's all right, girl. They're friends. They're here for him. We're safe now, I promise." After a tense standoff, Dakota let the vet and rangers lift Echo, still wrapped tight, onto a padded stretcher. Claire helped guide Dakota into the trailer, never letting her see her foal out of sight. Only when Echo was settled in the warm, softly lit bay did Dakota finally allow herself to collapse, her body pressed close to his, her breathing ragged but slowing. The rescue team quickly checked Claire for injuries. Her hands were red and raw, her cheeks wind-burned, and she swayed on her feet with exhaustion. But she waved them off, eyes locked on the two Mustangs. "Check them first. Please, I'll be fine." Inside the heated trailer, Dr. Kim and her assistants set to work. They checked Echo's vital signs, ran warm IV fluids, and gently massaged his legs to restore circulation. Dakota, wary but too exhausted to resist, stood close enough to nuzzle Echo's face whenever he whimpered. Claire watched, heart in her throat, as life slowly crept back into the foal's eyes. The room was quiet except for Echo's tiny snorts and the vet's gentle instructions. "You did everything right, Claire," Dr. Kim said quietly, her hands steady as she dressed Dakota's leg wounds and checked her for deeper injuries. "It's a miracle they both survived out there. With that storm and... What, a bear?" Claire nodded, the memory still raw. "We fought it off together. Dakota, she's the reason we made it. She protected Echo with everything she had." Dr. Kim's gaze softened. "Wild mares like her don't trust easily. You must have done something right." Once the horses were stabilized, the team bundled Claire in blankets and handed her a steaming cup of cocoa. Ranger Howard pressed her for details about the ordeal, jotting down notes for the official report, while the others set up a makeshift pen in the outpost's small barn for Dakota and Echo's overnight stay before transport to the Wildlife Rehab Center. As news spread through the radio and cell towers, townspeople and local volunteers started to arrive. Some brought extra hay, some blankets and towels, and some just stood quietly, awestruck by the sight of the wild Mustang and her foal. Claire, still shivering from cold and disbelief, watched as the community rallied together. People from all walks of life, united by a respect for the wild and for the fragile miracle that had stumbled out of the storm. That night, as the winds calmed and the first stars appeared above the broken treetops, Claire finally allowed herself to rest. She curled up on a cot in the outpost's back room, but sleep didn't come easily. She kept replaying every moment, The storm, the bear, Dakota's wild courage, Echo's fragile fight for life, and the final desperate trek across the snow. Morning brought the whine of truck engines and the bustle of a full wildlife rescue team. Claire stood beside Dakota as the Mustangs were loaded, Dakota's eyes never leaving her foal for a second. Volunteers lined the road, cheering quietly as the trailer pulled away, bound for the rehabilitation center a few towns over. News crews arrived, snapping photos and scribbling notes, eager to share the story of the Mustang, her foal, and the young biologist who'd risked everything to save them. At the Wildlife Rehab Center, a specialized vet team welcomed Dakota and Echo with gentle hands and soft voices. They moved Dakota and her foal into a large, straw-filled stall where they could recover together. The center's director, a soft-spoken woman named Margaret, met Claire at the gate. "We've heard all about your courage, Claire, and about Dakota's. They're safe here. We'll give them every chance." Claire stood by the stall for hours, watching the two Mustangs as they slept at last, side by side, wrapped in golden sunlight streaming through the barn windows. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a sense that finally the long ordeal was over. When she left the center that afternoon, the staff and volunteers lined up to thank her. But it was Dakota's eyes, calm, deep, and unblinking, that stayed with Claire the longest. There was no fear in them now, only a fierce, silent gratitude. News of their ordeal traveled fast, and soon Claire found herself fielding calls from journalists, conservationists, and even schoolchildren, wanting to know what it was like to stand shoulder to shoulder with a wild Mustang in a Montana blizzard. The town celebrated Dakota and Claire as heroes, their story spreading as a beacon of hope and a reminder that compassion and courage can bridge even the wildest divide. But for Claire, the true reward was quieter. The knowledge that, for a single extraordinary night and day, woman and Mustang had saved each other. And in doing so, they had inspired an entire community to see the wild, and each other, with new respect. The days following the rescue unfolded with a quiet, almost sacred intensity at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. For Claire, everything slowed. No more blizzards, no life-or-death decisions, no howling wind at the door. Instead, there was the simple rhythm of recovery, the hum of heaters, the soft voices of veterinarians, and the gentle rustling of hay as Dakota and Echo settled into their stall. Dakota, though exhausted and battered, remained fiercely protective of Echo. The staff quickly learned to approach her with respect, always announcing themselves at the door and never moving between mother and foal. Even inside the sanctuary, Dakota kept her body curled around her son, ears flicking and eyes keenly tracking every motion. If anyone got too close too quickly, she stamped a warning, a reminder that wildness doesn't disappear just because danger has passed. Echo, on the other hand, was a marvel. Each day, he grew a little stronger. Under the watchful care of the veterinarians and with Claire's frequent visits, his trembling legs steadied, and his eyes brightened with new curiosity. He explored the stall, sometimes venturing a few wobbly steps away from Dakota, only to whirl back and bury himself in her warmth. His recovery was a testament not just to the center's expertise but to Dakota's unbreakable will. Claire visited as often as her own recovery allowed. Though physically and emotionally drained, she felt a profound responsibility and a bond she could not ignore. She often sat quietly on a stool in the corner of the stall, reading from her battered field journal or humming soft tunes she remembered from childhood. Dakota would watch her for long minutes, sometimes edging closer, always with Echo at her side. There was a new understanding between woman and Mustang, but it was nothing like ownership or control. Dakota allowed Claire near, even letting her stroke Echo's neck and offer him bits of apple from her palm. But the wild mare made it clear. The trust was hers to give, never to be taken. More than once, staff and volunteers whispered about how remarkable it was to see Dakota calm in Claire's presence, when with everyone else she stayed on guard. The rehab staff understood this bond, and they made sure Dakota's time at the center was defined by respect, not confinement. No halters or ropes, no efforts to break her. When she needed treatment, like rebandaging her wounds or checking her legs, they moved slowly, asking for permission with every step. Some days, Dakota permitted their care. Other days, she demanded space and they listened. The center's director, Margaret, called it the wild contract. Dakota chose to accept help for Echo's sake, and in return, the humans honored her independence. Claire found herself reflecting often on what it meant to truly help a wild creature. She realized that courage was not about forcing Dakota to trust her, but about being trustworthy enough to wait until Dakota made her own choice. That meant showing up, being patient, and respecting boundaries, even when her heart ached to reach out more directly. Echo's progress became a small miracle that drew people from all over. Local school children came on field trips, pressing their faces to the glass as the foal played with tufts of hay or chased dust motes in the sunlight. Dakota tolerated the attention, so long as Claire was there, or the staff kept a respectful distance. Her wildness was never on display for entertainment. Instead, it served as a lesson in humility for everyone who watched. At one point, the center received an offer from a private rancher, someone who promised open pasture, gentle hands, and a life of safety for both horses. But after discussing it as a team, and with Claire's input, the staff agreed. Dakota and Echo belonged in the wild. The sanctuary was only ever meant to be a safe passage back to freedom, never a permanent cage. The town's respect for Dakota grew as news spread of her story. Her defiance and loyalty, her absolute refusal to let go of Echo or to be dominated by fear, became the stuff of local legend. People who had never given much thought to wild horses found themselves following her progress, reading updates in the paper or watching nightly news segments that spoke, often in hushed tones, about the Mustang that survived the storm. Meanwhile, Claire found her own life subtly transformed. The media attention was overwhelming at times, but she did her best to redirect the spotlight back to Dakota and the cause of wild horse conservation. She gave talks at local schools, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as she told the story. Not just of rescue, but of trust earned under the harshest conditions. She stressed that Dakota was not a pet, nor a project, but a wild creature whose loyalty was won through respect. One afternoon, while Claire was writing her final report in the quiet office near the barn, Margaret joined her. The director smiled, setting a hand on Claire's shoulder. "You know, not everyone gets a second chance to do something that matters. But you gave Dakota and Echo their future, and you taught all of us what real compassion looks like." Claire looked out the window, watching Dakota stand tall in her stall, Echo curled at her side. The Mustang lifted her head, meeting Claire's gaze through the glass. There was no fear now, only a deep, unspoken knowing, a recognition between two survivors. Claire felt her eyes fill with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude. As the days grew longer and spring edged into the valley, the staff began preparing for the Mustang's release. Their injuries were healed, their bodies strong, and their spirits unbroken. The wild, after all, was still out there, untamed, unpredictable, and waiting. The center hosted a small farewell gathering, inviting everyone who had helped, from veterinarians to volunteers to school children who'd sent get-well cards. Claire spoke last, her voice soft but sure. Trust isn't about control. It's about respect, and it's about letting go, even when you want to hold on. Dakota showed me that real courage is choosing trust, even when every instinct screams to run. The applause was quiet, heartfelt. Dakota and Echo were led out into the sunlight, the barn doors thrown wide. Dakota paused just outside, nostrils flaring, and looked back at Claire one last time. For a moment, time hung suspended. Then the wild mare tossed her head, whinnied, and led Echo into the open fields, disappearing into the freedom they were always meant to have. And in that moment, everyone watching understood. Healing is not the same as taming. Real love and respect sometimes means letting go, so the wild can be wild, and trust can be a gift given, not a chain. Spring dawned crisp and gold over the Montana wilderness, painting the horizon in hopeful hues. At the sanctuary's far meadow, a small crowd gathered behind a low fence, breath clouding in the morning air. It was a day many had waited for, a farewell years in the making, and yet impossibly sudden. The grass was finally pushing through the old snowdrifts, and the world, once battered by blizzard and fear, seemed ready for something new. Claire Bennett stood near the gate, hands jammed into her jacket pockets, watching Dakota and Echo with a heart full of pride and bittersweet longing. Dakota, healed in body and unbroken in spirit, moved restlessly in the corral, the sun catching the glossy sheen of her coat. Echo, now strong and steady on his feet, nudged his mother's flank, eyes wide with curiosity and anticipation. For weeks, both Mustangs had grown stronger, roaming the sanctuary's protected fields, always together, always wary of the boundary but never trying to escape. But today the gate would open, and they would return to the wild, a place where nothing was promised, but everything was possible. Claire's mind replayed every chapter of their journey. The blizzard's first scream, Echo's plunge into icy water, Dakota's desperate trust, the terror and triumph of the bear, and the long days of healing defined not by ownership, but by shared survival. The pain and exhaustion, the moments of near defeat, the wordless conversations in the firelit cabin, all of it had built toward this moment. A hush fell over the gathered crowd as Margaret, the sanctuary's director, stepped forward with a gentle nod to Claire. "You ready?" Margaret asked quietly, her voice carrying warmth and understanding. Claire nodded, her throat tight. "They're ready. They've always been ready. It was us who had to learn how to let go." Margaret smiled, then addressed the group. "Today, Dakota and Echo return to the wild, where they belong. This isn't just about two horses, but about all of us remembering what it means to be stewards of the wild, not its masters." As the gate creaked open, Dakota lifted her head, ears pricked and nostrils flaring. For a long, still moment, she stood poised between two worlds. The crowd seemed to fade away, the noise and bustle of human life shrinking to nothing compared to the vast silence and possibility waiting beyond the fence. Echo looked to his mother, searching her eyes, and Claire felt a pulse of understanding. Trust was never truly about safety, but about the courage to risk the unknown for those you love. With a toss of her mane, Dakota surged forward, hooves flashing as she crossed the threshold. Echo sprang after her, a blur of energy and hope. They bounded into the meadow, running, leaping, as if shaking off every memory of pain and confinement. For a heartbeat, their wild calls echoed off the distant hills, filling the valley with a sound older than any storm. The Mustangs disappeared into the tall grass, shadows swallowed by sunlight, their freedom a promise carried on the wind. A profound, peaceful silence followed, broken only by the quiet sniffles and smiles of those gathered. Claire felt tears burn her eyes, not of grief, but of awe. She thought of what Dakota had taught her, and what she hoped everyone watching would carry away from this day. Later at the community hall, Claire stood before a packed room. Journalists, conservationists, students, and ranchers crowded in, faces expectant. Photos of Dakota and Echo adorned the walls, and the local news had already started calling the event the night Montana trusted. Claire felt the weight of expectation, but also the clarity of purpose earned in the blizzard's crucible. She began simply, "I was just doing my job, but I learned something out there in the storm that changed me, and I think changed all of us who witnessed it." We're taught to believe compassion is about control, about taming what we fear, rescuing what's in danger, imposing our solutions. But the wild has its own lessons, if we listen. The crowd listened in total silence as Claire spoke from her heart. Dakota didn't need taming. She needed a chance. She taught me that real courage isn't forcing someone to accept your help. It's risking everything for those who can't ask. It's showing up night after night, even when you're terrified. And it's having the humility to know when it's time to step back and let someone go. She looked at the rows of students and volunteers who had followed the Mustang's journey, her gaze lingering on the younger faces. I hope you remember, compassion isn't about making the wild submit. It's about respect, about giving space, not just rescue. When we let go of control and meet the world on its own terms, we discover real heroism. That's when we become worthy of trust. As applause filled the hall, Claire realized the truth. Their story had sparked more than just headlines. It had inspired local wildlife officials to create new protocols for blizzard search patrols and emergency animal rescue. The community started a fund for maintaining wilderness shelters and teaching animal first aid in local schools, and children sent drawings and letters, calling Dakota a hero, reminding everyone what true bravery looked like. Spring wore on. The meadow grew lush and wild. Sometimes early in the morning, a rancher or hiker would spot two dark shapes running at the edge of the trees, one tall and regal, one smaller but gaining strength with every stride. Rumors spread, and for a time it seemed the whole town watched the horizon, hoping for a glimpse of the Mustangs who had reminded them all what wildness and trust truly meant. Claire never tried to visit Dakota and Echo after their release. She knew better. Their story, their legacy, was never about possession. It was about the courage to trust, to fight together, and then, when the time was right, to let the wild run free. And so, in the wild places of America, the lesson endured. True heroism is not control, but the willingness to risk everything for those who can't ask for help. Compassion is not about taming or owning, but about respect and the courage to let go. Only then do we see the wild not as something to conquer, but as a partner in the shared story of survival and hope. As the years passed, Dakota and Echo became legend. The blizzard, the bear, the battered cabin. These became stories told at kitchen tables and campfires. Lessons about the kind of trust that changes the world. And somewhere, far beyond the fences and the eyes of men, two Mustangs ran beneath the open sky, their wildness unbroken, their story a living reminder of the day the storm taught everyone what it means to be truly free.